Hi, good evening. Hello. I think we're going to start now. So would you please take a seat? So welcome to Asia Society. I'm Yasufumi Nakamori, Director of Asia Society Museum and Vice President for Arts and Culture. It gives me great pleasure tonight to introduce and inaugurate a new series, the annual South Asian Arts Talk in celebration of the life of Priyanka Mathew, made possible by a generous gift by Priyanka's sister, Divya, and the Mathew family. Beginning today, with a renowned Pakistani-American artist, Shahzia Sikander, and globally esteemed curator, Diana Campbell, the annual program series will invite distinguished scholars, authors, curators, and artists from South Asian and South Asian diaspora arts and academic communities to present their research, exhibitions, and new ideas on visual arts, exploring creative expression from the traditional to modern contemporary. This series, pegged to Priyanka's birthday, shared with Gandhi's actually birthday, was today, as a matter of fact, October 2nd. The series celebrates her achievement and vivacious spirit, even as we know it'll be a big task to match her spirit. Priyanka was deeply devoted to South Asian art as a collector, as a first Indian woman auctioneer at the Sotheby's, as an entrepreneur, and as ambassador, bringing art, education, and her deeply humanistic and warm presence to communities around the world, and especially in Pakistan, which was a particular passion of hers. Priyanka championed and supported a number of emerging artists who became her friends, and they could often be found enjoying her hospitality and excellent home cooking at her beautiful apartment, which doubled as an art salon. Speaking of which, many of the young artists she championed really had incredibly successful careers, including Salman Tour and of course Shahzia Sikander. Priyanka was a friend and supporter of Asia Society, understanding the critical role that art plays across pillars and in a global, interconnected world. She stated following: art has always been an ambassador to reflect critical dialogues around socio-economic moments and will play an increasingly important role in the post-pandemic world. Priyanka was a professional trailblazer and maverick, a dancer, chef, and friend, as well as a devoted sister, aunt, and daughter. We are honored to have members of Mathew family here this evening, including from as far away as Bangalore. To mark this special occasion, we thank them for trusting Asia Society with Priyanka's legacy and hope this inaugural talk rises to their sister and daughter. I would now like to invite Dr. Beth Citron, Curator of Modern Contemporary Asian and Asian Diaspora Art at Asia Society Museum, to introduce our speakers tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Yasufumi. It's a distinct honor to speak in celebration of my friend Priyanka's life and to introduce our speakers this evening, both of whom I've had the privilege of knowing and working with over many years. We were thrilled when Shahzia Sikander agreed to be the inaugural speaker in this series, in no small part to center a strong woman with deep ties to Pakistan and America. As we'll hear this evening, Shahzia Sikander is widely celebrated for subverting Central and South Asian miniature painting traditions into dialogue with contemporary international art practices and launching the form today known as neo-miniature. Sikander's paintings, video animations, mosaics, and sculpture explore gender, sexuality, racial narratives, and colonial histories, engaging ideas of language, trade, empire, and migration through feminist perspectives. In Pakistan, Sikander taught miniature painting to younger artists, including Imran Qureshi. And in the United States, she has been strongly connected to artists including Sarah Z, Teresita Fernandez, Janine Antoni, Kara Walker, Rick Lowe, and Carrie Mae Weems, among many others. Sikander even curated the work of major American artists, including Julie Moretu's first exhibition. Sikander is a recipient of the MacArthur Award and the Pollock Krasner Foundation's Pollock Prize for Creativity, among others. Her wonderful survey exhibition, Collective Behavior, presented by the Cleveland Museum of Art and Cincinnati Art Museum as a collateral event of the 60th Venice Biennale, is on view until October 20th of this year. In the New York area, in the past 5 years alone, she's presented solo projects and exhibitions at the Morgan Library and Museum, and at Madison Square Park, and at the Newark Museum. Her work has been presented in prestigious venues globally, including the Dhaka Art Summit in 2014, and to name one very local special example, in a two-person show with Nilima Sheikh at Asia Society back in 2001, under Vishaka Desai's leadership. She serves on the boards of IFA NYU, RISD, and Art 21, and she's a mentor at Columbia University. We are thrilled to have Shahzia here today with Diana Campbell, who's engaged with Shahzia's work for over a decade. Diana Campbell, in both her curatorial and writing practices, focuses on institution building and creating forms for interdisciplinary cultural convenings globally. She is the artistic director of the inaugural edition of the Bukhara Biennial, Recipes for Broken Hearts, launching in September 2025. Campbell's also the founding artistic director of the Dhaka-based Samdani Art Foundation in Bangladesh, and she's the chief curator of its flagship project, the Dhaka Art Summit, having led its critically acclaimed editions from 2014 to 2023 as she plans ahead for 2026 and beyond. Without further ado, we'd like to welcome both of them to the stage for what promised to be an exciting conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much for being with us tonight. And it's such an honor, I think I'm speaking on behalf of Shahzia and I, to have this conversation, which is a memorial to someone who was also a very strong woman, someone who loved India, loved America, loved Pakistan, loved so many things, and refused to be reduced into the boxes that she was born into. And I think something that's interesting when we think about like the word miniature painting, or like Micronesia, where my mother's side of the family comes from, these are words that are meant to kind of reduce and make things feel small. But something that Shahzia, Priyanka, and I think all have in common is that we feel like the world can be very, very big. And sometimes that's difficult when things are bigger than the lines that were drawn for you to stay inside. So I think this might be an interesting way to kind of start this conversation with Shahzia, whose lifelines were in Pakistan, Somalia, America, so many different places. Like, what were these storylines that drew you into becoming an artist, Shahzia?
Thank you, Diana. Thank you, everybody. Of course, I think the hardest thing is to try to sort of go backward in time and try to explain everything, but I am so grateful to be here in this moment right now in this fantastic city, New York, and to reconnect with you. We've had so many years and cyclical histories. So, you know, I grew up in Pakistan. I was born there. I moved to the US in '93, and I was an adult. But at the same time, I have spent most of my time as an artist in the US. So I think that also is very interesting to see how we negotiate these spaces. I grew up in a large family, multi-family, multi-generational family. I also wanted to share a book that we did, Roots and Wings. And I thought it would be great to actually show this because though the book is about my childhood, but it's also a lens through which one of my pivotal works, the scroll painting, which basically was a game changer for manuscript paintings, contemporary manuscript painting in Pakistan. We were able to share that. Sorry, I'm having a hard time with the slides.
So this is you painting the scroll, right?
Yes.
And that's also interesting, at least when you're looking at like the history of miniatures. It's not usually like a woman painting herself in what you're in those manuscripts, no?
No, so for me, it was really critical to use the language, but also to keep it very abstract. So how you could use an incredibly precise language and yet think about the anxiety of youth.
Maybe we should also talk a little bit about that language and how it was seen at the time, right? Because miniatures, I mean, I don't know if everyone here is familiar with miniatures, or also how it wasn't really a thing that was considered contemporary at the time that you were working with it in the 80s.
Yeah, so of course, I think 1980s, at that time, there was no term, the neo-miniature didn't exist. And at the same time, I had, I was familiar of the sort of tourist kitsch. So it was something that I questioned, but I also wanted to understand that in terms of one's relationship to culture, because abstract expressionism was big, and I didn't want to just create a relationship to that as a very derivative idea. So I became more interested in the politics of like high art and low art, and how something like that could translate into one's understanding towards the application of the language, but also in terms of one's relationship to culture. So I was studying mathematics, and I went to the National College of Arts from the Canadian College of Women.
In Lahore.
In Lahore. And I had also gone to the Convent of Jesus and Mary, so I had a variety of education. I had spent time in Somalia also as a young adult. So these were all these sort of cross-cultural, across different religions. These notions were really sort of at the thrust of why one wanted to be an artist. I gravitated towards humanities. I think also the time at that time was Ziaul Haq's military dictatorship. So it just made sense to be with other artists, to think outside of, to think collectively through the humanities, to think about literary histories, poetry, poetics and poetry. Like even now, I think the strongest feedback and things that I have where I draw most inspiration from are radical feminist poets. So those were my concerns even as a young person in Pakistan. And the thesis itself got a lot of attention, and I was asked to come and teach right away. So though I had finished my thesis, I started teaching at the National College of Arts. And I think it was a really exciting moment because there was, it sort of signaled that youth was interested in some cultural dynamics that were often laden with notions of craft and not intellectually engaged activities. So as a painter, I was not that interested in doing still lifes or the industriousness that sort of echoed in that school. Kipling was the president of NCA when it had opened. So there was all these histories and layers. And at the same time, it was like, how do you activate the miniature painting traditions without relegating them to contemporary takes of festivals and contemporizing weddings? How could you think in a more radical manner? So how could you think abstractly and yet be engaged with a very precision-based medium? So that tension, I think, still exists in my work, this in-between space. Like, how do you engage things that are outside of the binaries, and how that can be fecund?
And we were also talking, so if you're looking at this slide, you're seeing kind of the way, can we go back? like, it's difficult because sometimes people don't know how to talk about that, right? Or there's like different, how do you say, standards for which you write about things. So here you were circling like Shahzia installs Lady Justice in quotes, like outside of US court, right? Like you're reduced just to your first name, you're reduced to your identity. It can be difficult to be in that space.
Absolutely. But I also think, like, interestingly, a Pakistani origin American artist. And in the US, you're constantly, like, pre 9/11, it would have been Pakistani-American, but post 9/11, it was often seen as a Pakistani artist that is working in New York. So these labels fluctuate so radically and so sort of in the moment of the different types of politics. And I'm sure you must deal with that too.
All the time.
When you're organizing the biennials, like how people have to fit in different categories. And if you don't necessarily fit in those categories, then you're less authentic, or you're outsider, or you're not part of a canon. And if you're not part of a canon, when do you become the canon? Or how do you change the canon? So I think all of these things were of interest to me from, like, since I was a child.
Since before you even knew how complicated it would get, in a way. Maybe let's talk a little bit about this study for the scroll. So maybe through the work, can you talk about like who Shahzia was at that moment in the 80s before coming to New York?
Yeah, so a lot has been, I often get defined by the scroll painting. So of course, before the scroll painting was also a study. And also to understand like how, you can't just wake up and suddenly start painting in a very distinct way with the manuscript painting tradition. So though I was learning how to do all of that, you had to subject yourself, your mind, your body to a slowness.
But you're also making your own paper, you're also making your pigments, right? It's a very technical process as well.
Absolutely, but also like studying, like working at it 10, 12, 15 hours a day. So, but sometimes your mind would race faster, and the slowness takes a while for you to train your mind, just like meditation or something. So I wanted to share such works because I think it was very important to show that you, as a thinker, you were thinking in different ways. So even a mosaic, the mosaic nature of the collage here would have been, it's a large-scale painting. So it was also to sort of counter the narrative that I found myself in the US, that you were seen as a traditional artist. Though I had already done incredible innovation in the manuscript painting, contemporizing it, but when I came to the US, then there was that additional burden that, you were coming from a particular culture, so this must be the language. So I think sharing another point that I want to make is that I was looking at Safavid painting. So I was also wanting to cast a very broad net, like go backward so far in time that one was looking at things that had predated colonial histories. So, it wasn't like just a contemporary international artist's works, but deliberately looking at historical things to create a relationship, and then that juxtaposition here speaks to it. Currently, the show in Venice is sort of an excerpt of a survey. The survey happens later, and here you can see the scales of the works as well.
This is interesting. Like we were also talking about like migration or displacement, and actually a lot of the works that you were references to, you were only seeing in books, no? Because a lot of them were outside of Pakistan.
Yeah. So this, just as an example, the two images that you see, the one on the right is what a reproduction would be in just a book printed in the 80s that I would have access to, whether it was a catalog by the British Library or the Smithsonian or something else. It was a printed image of a manuscript painting. And my first sort of major encounter of looking at the Badshah-nama under the microscope is like a whole epiphany of like how alive the works are when you see them, where you have the privilege to seeing them that's in that manner, they become incredibly alive, and the color is completely different. So I wanted to emphasize that so much of that, perhaps now things are available digitally, but in the 80s, you were just making a guess. So how do we ascribe authenticity when things already are not around you? They were already sort of like much of that material would have been dismembered and broken up and bought in secondary markets. And, the example would be the Shahnameh. Like, that becomes the Houghton Shahnameh at the Met, and then it circulates around the world and gets bartered with a de Kooning much later. So, like, these are very real stories around colonial legacies and the archives. So my interest was how does an artist repurpose the archives for creative functioning? So that's how I started to dig. And this would be just one other example of, like, a standard coffee book table around Persian art, Indian art, or Islamic art. And then you would see these shadowless objects, and I always thought of them as little monsters that needed to escape their representations. So as I imagined them in those ways, I could use a lens around the female. So that I wanted to show the juxtaposition, so as to show, like, how a personal lexicon started to occur. And though the work is far from being autobiographical, it started to take on notions of the feminine as something which obviously was always coming up against the issues around power. So whether it was lack of representation, whether it was erasure, whether it was narratives that needed to be centered in, like, ongoing uneven colonial histories, like, how do you create relationships with experience and consciousness? What is the kinship there between race and culture? So all of these things were present in Pakistan. They were present in wanting to go from math into art, and they were very present as I started to examine things that became more visible and available to me as a young artist in the 90s, like early 90s in the US was, again, a very different moment than post 9/11 would be in the early 2000s.
And maybe let's talk a little bit about, like, what that shift felt like, right? Because the work, like, pre 9/11 and post 9/11, you can definitely feel that shift, but also the shift in how it was read.
Yeah, so, for me, it was always like, I was very engaged with other artists, so I was always working outside. So how could I use the manuscript as a documentation of sorts? So here I wanted to show how it literally becomes like people that I'm working with, other artists, and then if we're doing collaborative projects, it becomes a means to document that history. So, which becomes very different than being seen as always around identity. So it had little to do with identity, but the politics of the 90s was so couched in that discourse that no matter what you did, you got straitjacketed in terms of your biography. And it makes sense a few years, but like 15 years later, cut and paste that same press release. 20 years later, you're still struggling with that, okay, when will this stop? How do you when will the discourse dig deeper into what the art is about? So I think all of that and wanting to break outside of the preciousness of the manuscript, of course, I started to work around, I was working large-scale murals, but I was already a painter, so it wasn't like I had to train myself to do something differently. And then, of course, I was living in different parts of the US, moving from Providence to Texas and Houston and San Antonio. Then when I moved to New York, and also did a lot of projects in San Francisco. So there was always things evolved in conversation with other artists of my generation and other dynamics of different cities. So all of that becomes fodder for many works that start to happen, whether one is looking at the relationship between the different diasporas, the nature of how to engage with those politics. Like, I was in exhibitions with other African-American artists in the 90s, and perhaps something like that does not make much sense now when we police things around race so much. So I just feel like all of these moments have been very instrumental in terms of how I navigate categories and binaries. And for me, it's that the nature of being an artist for me is how to counter something which is expected. So when I'm thinking about the in-between space, it's almost like it is something which can't be imagined, or which will be a resistance to the expected. And that becomes really a very powerful idea. And of course, working in a language where it's, it's very precise, so how do you keep the narrative open-ended? And you can see things in the sense that I'm working with materials like directly on the walls, making some of my first sort of shows in New York were the Drawing Center, the Whitney Biennial. It was a big, moment for me to do my first show in New York and be covered, have 2 reviews in the same day with Michael Kimmelman and Roberta Smith. So it was a big kind of a rupture of sorts. And I think it also signaled that manuscript contemporary miniature painting was incredibly hip or on the rise. So it signaled that back to Pakistan, as well as to other parts in the world as well. So I think in that sense, being so much sort of not just an ambassador, but like continuously exploring, experimenting, and bringing the discourse into a contemporary arena was at the heart of how I started and where I was, whether it's pre-9/11 or post-9/11. It's just that when post-9/11, even show like Asia Society did in Hanging Fire, and I was not included in it. And I was like, oh, but all the artists are authentically Pakistani, but then many artists were people living in Boston, Melbourne, London, etc. So I think that kind of dynamic started to really emerge for me, that this sort of a erasure that started to happen. It was happening on both sides. So 9/11 would be, a kind of a very significant moment in time where you start to see for artists like from the global south, how they are positioned. Just one example, I think, just what does Islam look like? Like now, just sort of like the nature in which you would get hijacked, no matter how complex the work would have been, like this particular work.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about this work, so we can get into some of the iconography and hear what you were trying to say and what it was reduced to.
Well, it was a resistance to a very fetishized idea of the Muslim woman as needing to be saved, which was often the premise for the wars on terror, wars in Afghanistan. So I was trying to come up with a form that would counter that narrative and celebrate the sort of the courageous nature and the sensuous nature within the manuscript tradition, but also in terms of Muslim women didn't need saving. So then that gets hijacked in the current politics of that time, just as one example. Then, while you're getting a lot of my projects post 9/11, I moved to Berlin for a little bit with the DAD. I think it was this pressure that, okay, if you did not return to Pakistan, you weren't going to be included in the narrative of Pakistan as it was going to go global. I was told very much things of that nature, and at the same time, I was already in the US for more than 10, 12 years. I had a life, I had a whole situation going on. So I always felt why do all artists get this sort of choose between one or the other, whereas, what it meant to be a transnational artist, or how were artists defining that? And I think if you look at so much of my work around that time, it is incredibly ephemeral, it is done in the moment, it's collaborative, it was trying to create works which were which could embrace uncertainty, which could embrace flux, which offered multiple perspectives of a multivalence. And whether it was going into videos, animations, everything was drawn, like everything was connected to the idea of drawing. So for me, drawing became a thinking tool. And I could use the drawing as a libretto. When I met my friend composer Diana, and thinking about working with different other female artists, especially other Asian artists, especially defining what the Asian diaspora was and could be, and how we were all invested in stretching that language and stretching that representation, and so the work starts to think in those ways. It shifts. Like I'm thinking the monumentality of drawing, but I'm also thinking drawing as a vector, as elastic, as music. So.
And also looking, I mean, that last image, I love that work, the last post, right? But also looking at, if you are looking at artists from China, artists from Pakistan, how actually all of our histories touch. And I think that that's something that you've done. Maybe can you speak a little bit about that work? It was one of your first animations, right?
No, it was, I think, the first HD animation, probably done in 2009.
Yeah.
But it was also, we did a show at the Rockbund Museum in Shanghai, and I had just met Diana at the Bellagio residency, so we were working together. We had started to work, that was our first project together, but it was looking at the very nefarious histories of trade, opium trade, and using East India Company's language, visual language, but also historical language, and creating the piece, The Last Post, which basically also refers to the bugle call at the end of the day. So whether it's the end of an era or it's the end of the the hegemony in China, it was for me a way of pushing the boundary of the manuscript into something which was of the moment, dealing with different economies and how we are all connected in the same old patterns. And then Parallax happened soon after, and that was also connected to that, but it was for the Sharjah Art Biennial, and we ended up exhibiting that at the at the Dhaka Art Summit in 2014.
Yeah, and that was, I think, really interesting. Maybe so this is an image of that work, Parallax, which is a beautiful 3-channel animation, which you're also working with Duyun. And this was our first international Dhaka Art Summit in Bangladesh, a place where you can't rent HD projectors, right? It's not a place that has the demand to rent this kind of technical equipment. And Shahzia and I were talking, and we really wanted to share the work in South Asia, but the kind of technical ability to do that didn't really exist at the time. And this is not the kind of work, it's not good, if you're not showing it with the right projectors, you're not gonna feel it. It doesn't, it won't have that impact. But something that I think is so beautiful, this is an image of that work with kids just being mesmerized in Bangladesh in 2014. They'd never seen work like that. They'd never seen a painting that could move, and basically the expansiveness of this history that touched them as well. I'm rambling, but what was beautiful is collaboration. So Shahzia, you're collaborating all the time, and we figured out that through this collaboration with the Sharjah Art Foundation, they could lend us the projectors to be able to show this in Dhaka in the same way that you could see it in Sharjah.
Yeah. So that was really an interesting time, because while I was showing it working collaboratively over years and showing very internationally, but at the same time, around that time, I got denounced in Pakistan as not a Pakistani artist at the Lahore Literary Festival. And then I was told, well, come now and speak for yourself. So I was like, okay, I wasn't really fully aware of the denouncement, but then I was asked to come and speak. Yeah. So we both went together.
I was lucky to have been there to see that. But something I really liked about what you said was that I will take any critique about my work, but I will not take a reductionist view of my identity.
And also I felt I have an artist or any individual's chronology is theirs. If you, yeah, like to erase your chronology is is not correct. You can like or dislike the work. That's a whole separate issue. So it was really interesting that when we went together to Pakistan at that time at the Lahore Literary Festival in 2014.
Yeah.
It was right after having exhibited at the Dhaka Art Biennial.
But I think what's also beautiful, I like to think with open form thinking. So like I was very open with how we showed this work in Dhaka, and people were shocked, like, how are you showing something like that in Dhaka? Yeah. But Lahore used the same technique, which was wonderful to be able to show your work there in a future Lahore Biennale. And it was a way, you know, you're always open to showing your work and having that dialogue.
No, of course. That was really critical for me, is that that one is engaged with the younger generation and they have access to you and they can reach out to you. And I've always been very open about that. Yeah. And when COVID happened, I think that really changed the whole game, because whether you were getting invited or not, students could reach you online, and we started doing a lot of teaching via Zoom that was open to anybody, whether a kid from Rawalpindi wanted to come and attend or have access or show their work, or somebody from Brazil. So I appreciated that. But this is around the same time, just showing okay, how you're negotiating this in-between space where you're never going to be seen as an American artist or as a Pakistani artist.
It was
so
also
I've always thought of that as a stalemate.
Yeah.
And even now, even to this time, current time, when I think of the show I had at the Morgan Library, for example, I was able to look at my work after 20 years, and I saw that it was in incredible collections, very wonderful American institutions, but not once had any of those institutions exhibited the work. So then I've also felt okay, here is your fate, right, as similar to the fate of the manuscript works on paper that just go and reside in storage. And at that time, it was clear to me that I have to come up with a way in which I can create work that sits outside the walls or outside the storage. So sculpture and public art projects started to emerge.
And what year was that, would you say?
So these are 2015 were some of the things that I was applying for.
And these were at Princeton, or these images
yeah.
are at Princeton, right? Well, I'm also a Princeton graduate, and it's also great to see this, because in my time, Princeton was not engaging so much with contemporary art commissions.
So yeah, so this was, I think the stakeholders were economists, and I had put a whole of a summary around my wanting to develop, you can see there's East India Company men, but there's also Adam Smith, who's sort of has grown wings, but is fluttering, unable to fly despite the noble ideas. So there was a lot of play that was going on, but I needed to find places in which I could contextualize some of the intellectual inquiries that I was creating and making. So public art itself becomes incredibly a space for me in which I can test the ideas as well as continue to take risks. So rather than kind of go back and keep making a same work that you might have pressure to perform, I always did quite the opposite, and I guess maybe you got punished for it or whatever, but it was something that that keeps my curiosity alive, right? So I again, even if I'm working with different mediums, there's a function and a reasoning for it. Public art projects demand, you couldn't just make works on paper. And instead of just doing murals, I started to look into glass. And glass as a medium also was about stability and transparency, and something which was fragile and could be easily shattered, but was strong. So it had all these dualities, opacity, invisibility. So I thought it was a fantastic metaphor for me to engage with, and I could increase the scale. So public art projects were happening. I also had, I did a show at the Asia Society in Hong Kong, so the show was great, but then the book came, and then the book got censored. So the book was published, and then I was told that, some images had to be removed, so the entire book was redone. So that was, again, another kind of a shocking censorship for me. And jumping right into censorship, there was another recent censorship, which was about the sculpture that I had created. So,
Maybe let's talk about, like, in a way, this is all like training for what has just happened, right? In the sense of like the revision of your identity, the burning of the books, what we're coming to now. But this sculpture migrated out of drawings, correct? Like this sculpture didn't just come out of nowhere. It was years and years and years of experience. Maybe you can kind of speak a bit to those layers that built up this work, which sadly, I'm sure many of you read about, got decapitated.
So
recently.
here you can see the sculpture was at the University of Houston, and over there, the pro-life lobby decided to cancel the opening, the artist talk. Anyway, there was the rhetoric that was coming was also earlier from Tucker Carlson and Ben Shapiro and other people, and there had been very interesting. So sort of the gist of it, because we're rushing here, is that the problem was that the hair was in braids, and then the collar was a reference, a nod to Ruth Bader Ginsburg. So it got hijacked by issues around abortion. But Ruth Bader Ginsburg, it was definitely a nod for me, because that's the feminization of the judicial black male robe. And I had, the hair was braided because I was looking at all these syncretic histories from like Africa and Asia, and it's not Medusa. And I had also looked at the courthouse. So the courthouse bench chairs had the horns, and was also on the facade of the courthouse. In their frieze, there's a lot of reference. So those are the two issues that it got hijacked by, that it was satanic because of the hair or the braids, and then because it
celebrated a powerful woman.
So it was really interesting to see how that rhetoric enters Houston, where the project is currently right now, and not just that it led into further destruction. But here are the drawings. So when I was looking at at my own practice, but I was also looking at the courthouse to borrow elements and to understand how I could use, for example, the glass ceiling, and like the feminine form that's breaking out of the glass ceiling and hovering above, called hava. So it was air, and it was also atmosphere, and then the nature of it is on the roof of the courthouse. But here you see it in the park, and then this is what happened to it a year plus later. So here, this happened during like an hour before the hurricane in Texas. So, and it was also being positioned as if that it happened.
That weather did that, and not a
Weather did
person.
it.
Yeah, nice.
So there's so many layers to unpack here in terms of the fear that lurks, right? That I've always seen, like, there's this anything to do with women and power. It somehow, or where boundaries are shifting, the boundaries are shifting or melting, or however you may say it, but that the fear somehow emerges, especially when the context is around women. And this was a painting that originally had been censored in 2001. It was part of a large mural I was doing at Skaddenap's law firm, and I was looking at the ubiquitous nature of the female with the sword as like power of law, but coming at it from an Indian art history. And that unsettled people after 9/11, and it was like I was asked to remove it. It was sitting in storage for 20 years, and a PhD student said, take it out and tell these stories. So then again, I was like, if I'm going to tell the stories 20 years later, I'm not going to do a painting again. Maybe I make the painting into a sculpture and see what happens. So that's, again, coming back to what you asked, like sculpture sculpture there was a function and a reason for it. Because I do often get asked, like, why do I work in so many mediums? But I often say, like, I don't think I've ever heard or read Kentridge being asked,
Exactly.
so why do you
Double
work in so many
standards.
mediums?
Yeah, exactly.
So I think there's obviously a very interesting link between things, but of course we have very little time, and
We still have a little bit of time. I
Okay.
think we should go into this. I think that's what's also so beautiful is that, women, we're usually told not to complain and not to talk about these things. I'm a big fan of Sarah Ahmed. If you don't know the work, read it. But this feminist killjoy idea, it's important to inscribe these things so that they don't continue and that we learn.
Absolutely.
And this is a perpetual, this is not about you or me. It's a historical and cultural problem that needs to change. But back to the work, please.
Which is a really interesting way in understanding this image, because I was looking at problematic histories surrounding the archetypal nature of feminine forms in art history. So whether it's the Venus or the Devata, both unfortunately, were carrying a lot of baggage. So I was like, okay, these are the maligned monsters, and maybe I was playing on the idea of MoMA and Much Maligned Monsters, which also Partha Mitter's book on the 19th century European scholarship on how it considers Indian aesthetic as outsiders. So I was looking at these, the mannerist as the outsider aesthetic of the classical, and I identified these two characters as problematic. It took Met 20 years later to return this form. The Devata that I was speaking to in 1999, 2000, and then I think the piece was returned only in 2023. At that time, nobody was talking about decolonizing or repatriation of objects. So again, I think looking at the painting I had made and then thought, okay, this painting has been sitting in storage, and that sketch had a great, the idea was such a wonderful idea, and it was a tiny little sketch, 2 inches. So I was like, I need to extract that 2-inch sketch and perhaps imagine this as a sculpture. So that was how the sculpture was born. And of course, once it existed, it has been talked about in different languages by a younger generation. So again, I find that whole sort of idea of looking at my own practice in this manner, because oftentimes I would consider my work as an anti-monument, but because it was always works on paper, I couldn't use that term. Once I had the sculpture done, I could very easily say that the work was about the anti-monument, because it engages historical situations, but it refuses to glorify it. And so it's that constant critique to move forward, because history is very much about who gets to tell the story, and often the highest bidder tells the story. So anyway, after that, after I released that sketch from its fate in the storage, it has been traveling internationally. So I find that also there is this, it's almost like a case study. And then of course things that have been censored, now they exist at the Newark Art Museum, but I also did a Snapchat lens, so it could exist in the virtual space. And of course, there have been many multiple projects with the defining and participating with the South Asian female diaspora. So that's also been really a lifeline for me here, to engage with other artists and thinkers and collaborate with them and find ways of inserting that discourse in places I teach, whether I'm teaching at Columbia or at Brown. I've been very open about writing syllabus that takes, that disrupts the ways in which we tend to talk about South Asian art, whether historical or contemporary, and how to break out of those silos.
Yeah, no, I think it's also, it's about language. It's about finding your voice. Who are you going to share that voice with? And to kind of move out of this binary of the 90s or the early 2000s about you're American or Pakistani, and trying to look at things in a much more in a much broader sense of what it means to be a person alive today.
Yeah, absolutely. But also to, what it means as an artist, as a thinker. Because it's also, if you're just going to sit there and let others frame your mind, your work, your intellect, your art, then it comes, I think it's incredibly frustrating that then artists have to learn how to speak, how to understand history. So I think all of this starts when one is working or teaching and you're working with younger people. Like if I had guidance when I, when I got into the Whitney Biennial, for example, like that, I was still in Texas. And interestingly, I was selected while I was in Texas. So I had gone to Texas when everybody else from my graduating class was moving to New York. So if I had guidance or it would have, things might have, like I would have made some different choices as well. So I think I enjoy speaking with a lot of younger students and other artists and a lot of art historians, and you really sort of have a conversation, not just in the act of making the art, but also in terms of how our responsibility is there to push at the boundaries of how things get framed, especially in American institutions, in terms of like how contemporary and historical South Asian arts are understood. Like, what is that entrenched principle of organizing them, and how can we find ways in which, we can like shift their spaces, and that sort of is the kind of a thrust of the show, which is up in Venice, because I'm working with the contemporary curator. I'm also working with the historical curator, and I'm working with them, both of them together gives birth to very interesting conversations. So it's not like, that as a contemporary artist, you shouldn't be working with a historical curator. Coming back to relationships and continued relationships, I've been very lucky to have wonderful long-term connections with artists that are part of my generation, and that have been very much defining like what it means to be an American artist. But at the same time, as an Asian artist, between a very black and white American culture, you often find yourself neither here nor there. So I think these are important things that you push back at, and I think that could be in terms of, creating space for other Asian women, Asian artists, simultaneously.
And I think, maybe to close and then to open up for a few questions, but I think it's also about, as you said, being in dialogue to also train people to see more expansively or to see what you're seeing. And I think it's beautiful also with the rise of technology or with opportunities like talks like this, we can have those kinds of discussions and hopefully train a new generation of thinkers that don't think in the same binary kind of terms. So maybe with that, do we have any questions for Shahzia from the audience? Okay, we have, yes.
You mentioned growing up in the time of Zia-ul Haq in Pakistan. In your position today, and after everything that you've accomplished and experienced over those so many years, today when you look at Pakistan and you see Imran Khan jail, do you draw parallels to the Zia-ul Haq era? And how do you perceive that today?
Well, I think the youth having access to social media, the people being able to speak up, to show, that what they stand for, like I think that moment in Pakistan, which I was identifying when people were like stepping outside and speaking, and you can see all the collective energy of that. Like that, I think is everybody's right. All Pakistani students, young people should have access to their opinions, to having education, to having coming together towards something. So I think for me as an artist, that's the strive, that's the struggle, like to be able to keep pursuing whatever you understand, striving for the truth. And I think like all Pakistanis need that. Like that should be a right for everybody. So I think anything that facilitates that freedom, that allows them access to each other, that gives them that space, whoever is able to do that, that's how that's what I'm for. That's what we all are for. And in terms of like the 80s growing up with the military dictatorship, I think at that time I gravitated towards all the women, whether it was the human rights activists, whether it was Aurat Foundation, whether it was thinkers, poets. It was really the female space, which perhaps was the redemptive that pushed back at a very extractive idea. And I still hold that true, that's perhaps the space of giving and abundance that can counter the nature of extractive forces.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a through line across the practice. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes, you.
What criteria would you have for museum curators or public arts commissioners in selecting which works are exhibited or which works are collected?
So I was having a conversation actually with other South Asian, I'm part of, it's called SAF, South Asian Feminist Futures, and it was really interesting amongst South Asian women in the diaspora here, mostly artists, that very few South Asian artists' work gets collected by American institutions. And I was asked, like, maybe I'm the one whose work gets collected. And it's really, like, it isn't really true. And I think we were wondering, like, why, what is it? Why are artists that were born here, that have been working here, but there are very few even have, like, there are very few South Asian artists that even make it to the Whitney Biennial. So when will that change, or what is going to be the catalyst for that change? And I think that comes to a collective space, like more artists, more people writing about the art, more voices collectively speaking to the experience, more people writing critical analysis, more books coming out, and obviously more people that sit on the board of institutions. So more people changing the curatorial nature, so more people being involved in the museum at that level. Like, those things probably will make a shift, and more South Asian people supporting the arts. It's not one situation, it's a collective situation that has to happen. But in my experience, in the US, it's a very difficult situation for so many South Asian artists that may do lip service, maybe a token representation, maybe in a group show, or maybe may get the exhibition, but oftentimes that doesn't translate into being part of being collected by an institution. I'm not sure if that was the point you were asking, but if you have anything to say to that, Diana, because you have worked from such an international perspective, but also really very instrumental in shaping Bangladesh, art from Bangladesh, right?
Well, Maybe I saw this from another side as like an American that moved to South Asia when she was very young. So kind of the opposite. You move from South Asia here, I moved from here to South Asia. But it was the time of the rise of these kind of mega Asia shows. So like the India Highway or the Paris, Delhi, Bombay. And I was living in India and seeing, like talking to artists who were saying that their works weren't being selected because they weren't Indian enough. Like, they didn't have elephants. It was really ridiculous. Like there were some very, very poetic works, but to the curator, it didn't look South Asian enough. And so something that was really incredible, and there was a lot of, I think, youthful idiocy with how the Dhaka Art Summit started that grew with experience. But something that we didn't realize we were doing when we started this festival. So this festival, it now has 600,000 visitors in 9 days, shows about 120 artists from all over South Asia and the rest of the world. But what was unique about it was that we were showing like South Asian art to South Asian audiences. So you couldn't kind of work on these exotic tropes that work on these traveling shows like Paris, Delhi, Bombay in a city like Dhaka, but we could make shows in Dhaka that could then travel elsewhere in the world and give a more nuanced view. And it was also a place where, as we grew with confidence, which took time after you, but we realized that actually our audiences have no idea what MoMA is, no idea what RISD is, no idea what Gagosian is. So we actually started taking all the galleries and the museum shows out of the labels and spent the time really talking about the work. And what's amazing is a lot of these artists, some of whom had no gallery representation, are now in LACMA, Tate, MoMA, like big museum collections. But because we could create an environment where we could focus on the work in its context. But unless you spend time in that context, you can't understand it. So perhaps I would also add spending more time doing field work outside of the US, and not like 2 to 3 day trips, but actually like spending meaningful time or hiring people that have spent that meaningful time and that can see the world in a more expansive way than just east, west, north, south, etc.
True. Yeah. I think that was really one of the reasons why I was really keen that an excerpt of the show being organized by Cincinnati Cleveland could debut in Venice. Because I knew that the audience that will come there is oftentimes not the audience that will come all the way to the US. And that has been, for me, a very exciting idea that I was able to show work, and for it to have some kind of an interface with so many other artists from Asia as well as Europe. So I think it goes both ways, like opportunities that artists have to create to step outside of the familiar. And then for curators in particular to spend more than a day.
Okay, I think, Beth, do we have time for more questions, or are we? Okay, great, here, yeah.
The beautiful little drawing that you did of Diana and the goddess. You mentioned that it was 2 inches, and I wondered how many of your drawings are 2 inches. I mean, that's small.
So that detail was 2 inches in a notebook page. Okay. Yeah. So most of the manuscript style detailed works would be like a notebook page size.
It's absolutely beautiful.
I hope so.
Say something about it. Okay, one more.
So my question is, having moved out of your home country when you were so young, and you've lived your youth in a different place, and then you've traveled all over the world, when we migrate out, our sense of belonging is from the past, and then you keep meshing different cultures, and it filters into your work. And what you have to say also, you're too foreign for home, too foreign for here, never enough for both. And you create something so interesting through your work. But, there's always a sense of belonging that gets, missing, or you try to find it again and reinvent that. Where do you find your sense of belonging, and where is home now?
I think home's always been rooted in work.
That's a great answer.
That's
I'm going to use that one.
That's a great answer.
Maybe that's coming from my Catholic schooling. I don't know. But yeah, it's in the act of making.
And in a way, where you're making has also become much more diverse since that turn, right? You're now making in Munich, you're making in many, many places.
True. But also I grew up with Muslim grandparents that they had a very Sufi instinct. So I always thought to study, understand the beauty of Sufi thought was to dive into the manuscript histories.
Thank you so much, Shahzia.
Thank you.
Really sharing your path to be a catalyst, connecting the world and Asia in a global modern contemporary art. And Diana, thank you so much for the beautiful navigation for this conversation. This is going to conclude our first, actually, artist talk of the South Asian Artist Talk series in celebration of Life of Priyanka Mathew. Our thanks really goes to the artist and curator here, and also the Mathew family. Thank you so much for coming. And next year, please do mark your calendar again, October 1st of 2025, for next fantastic conversation. Thanks again.
Thank you.